All right, welcome to the show. This is another weekly Docker DevOps live YouTube chat. So sorry for the delays. We always have some sort of technical issue here on the show. So every week it's a new random thing, some new update on software, something doesn't work right, hardware failures. This week's guest, unfortunately, due to the random problems we're having with the internet and sound, won't be able to have my guest on this week because we couldn't get the audio to work right. So Marcos, who's actually the co-founder and current maintainer of Play with Docker, was going to be on, and he'll hopefully be on in the next couple of weeks. One of the plans for this show is from everything now through the DockerCon conference in a month. I'll have guests that are going to be speaking or doing something at DockerCon, and we'll have more of that each week, assuming that I can fix all the problems between now and next week. So if you're on the show, let me know. Give me a thumbs up in the little chat if the audio sounds good. I also tweaked that a little bit this week. So if the audio sounds a good volume and doesn't suck, let me know in the chat. And away we go. So if you're new to this show, I do this every week, and I basically help students in my courses that are going through Docker training or any sort of DevOps stuff. Obviously, it's more than just for my courses and training. We talk about other stuff on this show, like current events, things I'm working on, things you're working on. Feel free to share them in chat, and we can talk about them. And so the format is I sort of present some stuff at the beginning about what's going on this week, some new things I saw on the internet that you might be interested in, and then we get to your questions. So thanks. I see everyone doing thumbs up in the chat, so that's great. There's about, I don't know, a 10-second lag between what I say and it actually happening live on the internet. So so this week, I thought we would be talking with Marcos about all the things he's working on, but instead we're going to save that for next week, and I will talk to you about some crazy stuff, some really cool stuff that I'm excited about that happened this week, some free training, and a new GitHub repo for some new software. All right. So let me jump over to the browser, and I'll give you some info, and then I'll take your questions. All right. So hopefully the audio is still good. Yep. Okay. So this week, I just want to mention a couple of things. There are courses of mine that you can buy. You can check out all my free Docker and DevOps related resources at brettfisher.com/Docker. And I have a new thing that I launched a month or so ago, which is a podcast that you can check out there. You can also go to brettfisher.com/podcast. And that is clips from this show, sort of the best hits of the week from this show go into audio-only format. And then you can also see those as clips that show up on YouTube. And you can also now see those as video clips showing up in my courses. So specific things or specific problems that people ask about and I have good answers for end up in various ways. But if you're on the go and you need to watch this stuff or listen to this stuff, rather, when you're in your commute or maybe on a long walk, some of those are actually not even long. So it could be a short walk to your mailbox, like 3 minutes. So there's some short answers, there's some long ones, and I will be adding some more today and tomorrow, actually. I've got a couple that have been in the queue that need to get posted in there, so check that out. For DockerCon, someone just asked in chat, do you have any discount for DockerCon? Yes. The DockerCon coupon is coming up in a minute. I'm going to get through the news, and I'll share that link. All right, so the first thing I wanted to mention, beyond my courses and free stuff that you can all get on my website, is Kraken, which I have not tried yet. I want to play with it, but Uber launched a new open source project called Kraken. Great name. That's a really cool name, and I'm surprised that there's not already like 20 Kraken things on the internet. But the oh, my green screen is not perfect. Burp. There you go. So Uber has this new registry. So this is a thing that's been a talk. I mean, people have been talking about this for years about couldn't we get the ability for our images to somehow be stored in more than one place and possibly even replicate it across nodes or something like that. And so this is a pretty interesting solution, which is not using the Docker images as a replicated data storage, but it's actually using the registry. So in the past, you would have to maybe have registries that proxy other registries, and you would maybe have to create some automation that would pull images out of your registry and then push them up to another registry. But Kraken is this P2P or peer-to-peer type of solution where you could have one in each region of the world where your registry is, and then when you push up images, it would be available in all those places. If you're using a private data center, this is probably a common problem because you have private data centers in different places, and you would like a lot of those standard images to be replicated around. So it's a pretty neat little repo, and again, I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but it's getting certainly a lot of likes, and they have a pretty cool little visualization there that you can check out on their page, and that I will put that link into the chat. That's at github.com/uber/Kraken. All right, so next up, a good friend of mine, Jerome Pettis. We have been doing workshop live trainings for years. In fact, the way I got into doing live trainings on Docker and Swarm and stuff like that is by learning from him. So my very first one way back in like 2015, I think it was at DockerCon, learning from him. And he's a great teacher. He is going to be in an upcoming course of mine. You can guess which that one is. And we're going to be announcing that hopefully here in the next few months, that we're working on that together and some more details about what's going to be in that course. But he is doing workshops around the world, and he launched a YouTube playlist, which is basically the entire paid workshop from a KubeCon conference, which is a paid conference in London. They do them also in San Francisco, maybe other places. And he recorded the whole thing and put it live free on the internet. So it's pretty fantastic. It's hours and hours. What is it? 55 videos. I don't know how many hours of content this is, but this is really great stuff. He knows what he's talking about. If you don't know who Jerome is, he was one of the original DevOps engineers at Docker when they invented Docker. So he has been around a long time. He's got a great blog with some really solid material, and you should definitely check out his stuff. And if you get a chance to do one of his live trainings, they're great. So definitely, he's always traveling around the world. In fact, you can check out where he's going to be at container.training, which is his little website that I also help him with. I do mostly Docker and Swarm workshops at this point, and you can see our past workshops, and then all the ones he has scheduled are at the top. And then you can actually look at all those slides at the bottom. There's free open source slides for all that content. And yeah, go check that out. Let me put some of these links in the chat. And that way you can go check out his resources. And Container Training is a great place. It's actually backed by a GitHub repo that he maintains and that a couple of us help out with. Myself and Bridget from Microsoft and a couple other people over time have really helped a lot. And that's a great idea. I love open source training. We can't always have time to give open source training, right? Because we all have to pay our bills. So we've often got to do paid workshops. But a lot of times he's figuring out great ways to make his training available completely free in some format. So do follow him on Twitter, and you'll probably see more of that stuff. All right, last thing on my list is DockerCon, which is coming up in a month. And I do have a discount. I will put this in the chat. I don't get anything for this discount. They just gave it to me to give away. So if you haven't signed up for DockerCon yet in San Francisco, that is a 10% coupon. If you just put Captain Brett in the little promo field when you sign up. I will be there. I'm actually giving a talk on Docker and Node.js, and I'm doing a Swarm workshop that you can join. I think it's a 3-hour workshop. There's lots of workshops there. And if you're new to DockerCon, here's a pro tip. If you've never been to DockerCon before, it's one of the best community events of all time, and it's one of my favorites. In fact, it is my favorite of the year, just because it's pure container stuff, right? There's lots of other container conferences now, but DockerCon was the original container conference back when they sort of invented what we all consider modern technology of containers. And what's nice now is that they have a lot of different tracks, but one of the best things if you're new is when you sign up for DockerCon to sign up for Docker Pals. It may not be in the registration. I'm not really sure, but they'll probably send you an email about it. It's called Docker Pals. And what it is it will take a veteran of DockerCon and pair you up with that person. And then you get to meet like on the first night before the conference starts. You get to meet at the welcome event, right? And so you basically get to make friends before the conference starts. And then throughout the event, they'll have Docker Pal meetups so you can hang out with the friends you just met. You can learn about what they're doing and what you're doing. And it's a great way to get yourself in the community, because I always tell everyone these conferences, they're really expensive. So obviously you want to get as much as you can out of the content. But most of them, the content is put available online like YouTube free later. So if there's any chance that I can spend time with people and talking to people about what they're doing, learn from other people in a one-on-one or a small group fashion, and DockerCon has tons of that. So I always prefer to do that stuff because you can't replicate that later, right? I can always download and watch YouTube videos later on, and you get 99% of what was in that session by just watching it on YouTube. What you don't get if you're not at DockerCon is all the live interaction. And I'm not talking about necessarily going to the expo booths, because obviously if you've ever been to a conference, you know there's tons of vendors and they would all be happy to talk to you about their product. But really what I'm talking about is the community itself, the other people at the conference. And DockerCon has lots of areas dedicated to that. And one of those is Docker Pals. So even if you've maybe been once or twice and you just are looking to meet more people, especially like Docker captains, Docker community leaders, and speakers and stuff like that, check out Docker Pals, because those are usually the people that sign up to be mentors, are people that have been doing it a while. So, all right, so now is the time in our little show. We're a little bit running behind, so we may not have as much. I might not have as much time today to answer as many questions, but get your questions in the chat now. Anything that you can think of that I might have a good answer to. It doesn't have to be Docker. Let's talk about it. So I'm going to scroll to the top and we'll go through the list. I'm going to go through the list in order, and basically we'll go as long as I can before I lose my voice or I run out of time and have to jump on the next meeting. And really this is a format of, let's say, I have had success in the past with people helping them troubleshoot problems real time, but that's not always the best use of this. Usually giving people tips on how to get unstuck on general things is easier than me trying to figure out how to help you solve that really weird, quirky little problem on your server that no one else is having. So obviously if you're Google searching something and coming up empty, I'm probably not going to be the best answer, but I'll try. I'm always willing to try. All right, so scrolling up to the top, let's see. Biker's back. He's always got good questions. I'm assuming that you've got a good question for me. All right, so we've had some concern with our IT people that Swarm is not production ready and are pushing to go Kubernetes. I've told them I think we can be in for more or different problems if we jump ship. Interesting question. So I don't know where they're going to get that impression. Black Friday, that's the US holiday for the most online purchases of the year, and Cyber Monday following it, Visa and PayPal were using Swarm in production. So if you made transactions on the internet, chances are a Swarm was involved. I could talk about all the other people using Swarm in production, the universities, the insurance companies, MetLife, there's another insurance company. I can't think of Don's insurance company. There's all these companies that have been using it for years. I've been using it with my years, 3 years now, I think it's been around. Yeah, almost 2.5 years. The modern Swarm, what we know as Swarm mode, has been around 2.5 years. I have been using it in production with my clients. I know plenty of companies that have been using it for years. There are internet startups that you have probably used that offer free services that have been using it for years. So I don't know where people get the idea of something is not ready for production. If you go to Docker's website and just go to /customers, this is a list of sort of their A-game, customer list, all the ones they want to brag about. ADP, which does a majority of paychecks in America. You've got a lot of colleges here. You've got pharmaceutical companies. MetLife, which is a worldwide insurance company. All these companies, I would say 80 to 90% of these companies are using Swarm in production. Because until a year ago, I think it was about a year ago. Until a year ago, they didn't have a way to run Docker on Kubernetes. So if they were using it before then, which most of these were, they were all using Swarm. Now, the reality of today is that most of these companies, if they're large enough and they know Swarm and Kubernetes, they're using both, right? People use different tools for different solutions, different ways to solve problems, right? We don't all use the same programming language. We don't all use the same deployment tool, and we are not all going to use the same orchestrator. Docker's priority on making sure that things work is with Swarm as well as Kubernetes, and their customers buy Docker Enterprise because it does both. Right? That's one of the advantages to the Docker Enterprise platform, is that it has a choice of those two orchestrators. Swarm is easier to use. It's easier to get started. The files are smaller in terms of the deployment configurations, the YAMLs. Those are all smaller and easier. And then there are things that Swarm doesn't yet do. It doesn't have great jobs support for like a job system. It doesn't have necessarily all of the third-party support that you might need in your projects. And so that's what Kubernetes is there for when you need it. That's how I look at it. I don't always recommend, especially small teams, just jumping to Kubernetes because that's what the internet told them. I would say definitely try your hand at Swarm, and I would say use Swarm until you can't. If it doesn't work for your needs, if you're having problems that you can't figure out, if you've offered to get paid support from Docker and they can't help you with that problem because it's a known bug and there's or something that's just something that Swarm doesn't do, then you know. The nice thing is if you were paying for Docker Enterprise, you get support from both Kubernetes and Swarm. So whether or not you're using one or the other, it really doesn't matter. The thing I will say is that people have problems on Swarm with configurations or performance or whatever, and that's not necessarily always inherent to the application. It's usually their design or they're using a really old version, something like that. The same is true of Kubernetes, right? Like we hear all the hype on the internet, but realize that the internet is full of hype. No tool is perfect. No tool has zero problems or zero bugs. So if you're thinking of jumping from Swarm to Kubernetes, assume that you will have similar or different challenges, right? Storage is always a challenge. Networking is always a challenge. Proxy configurations and performance are always a challenge in larger environments. Now, if you're just running 5 servers, you should totally just be using Swarm, or consider using Kubernetes on a cloud platform where you don't have to run it yourself. Use AWS's solution. Now DigitalOcean has a solution. Azure has a solution. All these companies are building out Kubernetes managed systems so that you don't have to deploy your own Kubernetes. Because one of the big challenges with Kubernetes is building up all the different features and tools that you need in a way that's reliable and redundant and secure. That has created an entire little ecosystem of a bunch of different tools to help you deploy and manage Kubernetes. But I'm always a fan of letting someone else do the work if I've got budget for it, and the Kubernetes projects out there with the cloud hosters aren't that expensive, and compared to the rest of the infrastructure you're going to be buying, it's not that much more money in my opinion. So humans are typically the most expensive thing in a project, and if you don't have more time to manage all those systems, all those servers, then I always recommend using a cloud vendor that will do that for you. So hopefully that helps. At the end of the day, I think whatever works for you works for you. But I would be very careful of ever jumping from one product to another. And this is a story that we've been telling over and over again, especially in DevOps and development, right? People were using .NET. This is a story of mine, using .NET, and then Node.js came out. And we thought about migrating an app over to Node.js. And we did, but of course it took forever. And it didn't necessarily reap all the benefits that we'd expected. We got new problems because we shifted platforms. The same has been true for years of the DevOps products, like moving from Chef to Puppet. There's no perfect tool, so there was always challenges on one side and challenges on the other. What I sometimes like to do is say that you have known problems now, and if you can solve those known problems, at least you know them. The thing that you've never done before, that tool that you've never used, that has unknown problems. And so you're going to start to deploy it, and you're going to realize that there are things that it doesn't do well. So people shift sometimes from Swarm to Kubernetes, and sometimes people shift from Kubernetes back to Swarm. It just depends on what their motivations are, what their problems are, and what their project needs are, really. So I think at this point, I always prefer people try Swarm first, especially if they're a very small team. And what I mean by small teams there is 3 or less than 3 full-time DevOps people. If you don't have that many people, then if you're going to do Kubernetes, definitely do a cloud-hosted Kubernetes, not roll your own, because it's going to be a lot more work to maintain. Unless you're doing something like Docker Enterprise, maybe Rancher, something like that, where they're managing the deployment and the infrastructure for you and setting up redundancy and security and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully that helps. Great question. All right, who's next? Imbanez? Let's see if that's how you would pronounce that. Hi, Brett. Great work. I have a container in network mode equals host that monitors host ETH0. Can I send messages from this container to a RabbitMQ container that is inside a different bridge network? Yes. So you would just add, a different bridge network. So it sounds like you're doing Docker run and not Docker swarm. So if you're doing, because if a bridge network would be just on a single machine Docker host. So I would say there, yes, just add it to multiple networks. When you configure it, you can add it to a host network, a null network, a bridge network. If you're in Swarm, you can also add an overlay network. So yes, you can just add it to multiple ones, and then you'll use the DNS of the name of that container, right? So if your RabbitMQ container is called RabbitMQ, then from the one that's monitoring your host ETH0, you would just use the DNS of that other container, and then it would prefer the bridge network instead of trying to use the host network, right? So that should just work. In fact, I have an example of how to use that on Swarm with traffic, because a traffic proxy in a configuration that I've used would use Ethernet 0, the host network raw, right? So it'd have direct access to that port on the host, and then it can also connect to backend overlay networks for passing traffic through the proxy. And that's how that would work. So yes. And you can connect that network to a running container using Docker Network Connect, I believe is the right. Let me just check on that. Yeah, Docker Network Connect. And then that would allow you to connect an existing running container to a new network like that bridge network without having to stop it. So that should work. Try that out. All right, next question. Yes. Oh, so Kylex is in saying he's doing Docker Pals. Great. Great. You're a guide. Thanks. So yeah, you might get him as a guide if you go to DockerCon. That would be awesome. Tim Rice says, what's your take on Openshift versus Docker Swarm? So I've never used Openshift other than just playing around with it, right? So I don't have any real world production experience on it. Openshift is Kubernetes. It's a Red Hat custom Kubernetes. And it's really hard to compare because Swarm is very much like open source upstream Kubernetes. It's sort of a do-it-yourself solution where you're going to be adding things like Portainer to Swarm, traffic to Swarm for proxy. Portainer would be the GUI management. You might need special storage solutions or stuff like that you would use as plugins. You need a third-party monitoring solution, logging solution for centralized logging. OpenShift is the Red Hat official way. And in fact, if you're considering OpenShift, I'm assuming that's because you're on a Red Hat distribution. And if you are, and you're all in on the Red Hat way to do things, then you probably should be using OpenShift. It's going to be obviously much more complex. There's a lot more to it than there is to Swarm. So it's going to be more work to do. But typically, people that are running Red Hat, they already have plenty of staff, and they're doing that in production anyway. So I will say that Red Hat Enterprise Linux is moving away from all Docker tooling because they're technically competitors, and Red Hat's motivation is to not depend on a competitor's tooling. So their latest release, the beta release of 8, actually doesn't have any Docker engine even installed. Now, you can install it, but then you're going the unsupported route of Red Hat. And for a lot of people, the reason they run RHEL is to get that full stack support from Red Hat. So I think it kind of depends on your motivations, on where you're trying to get your support and your official applications, right? So if you're considering OpenShift for something other than a paid Red Hat distribution, then I would say it's very comparable to other Kubernetes distributions that you build yourself. And those require more people, require more time, but have more features and functionality out of the box than Swarm does. And that's really, I'm trying to think of another analogy. There's a reason we don't all program in C, right? We have these higher level, easier languages that are faster for developing web apps, for example. We've got node.js, now Go language is popular. We've had Ruby on Rails for a while. And those are all easier languages to develop. So we do those. Now, they have benefits and cons, right? They're not as fast as running raw C or assembly, but none of us have the time or resources to do that. So that's maybe a poor analogy, but that's similar to the difference between maybe an Openshift and a Swarm, or something like, building your own upstream pure open source Kubernetes on your own, instead of using a cloud hosted or something like Docker Enterprise that does it all for you. For example, Docker Enterprise is a sort of click install kind of solution where it will set up the Swarm and Kubernetes with just a couple of clicks or a couple of commands on each server, and they give you sort of guidance on how to do that. So they manage that deployment, the encryption, the fault tolerance. They do all that for you, and that's similar to Openshift. And so again, I don't have a ton of experience, so I can't give you the details. But I would say that if you're considering the two back and forth, then just check out Swarm, right? I've got a Swarm course at swarmmastery.com. Check it out because it is an easy button to solve some problems. And if it works for you, you could probably figure out pretty quickly because it supports compose files. So you can deploy an app with compose files essentially. So you don't need to learn a whole new thing just to get it working. And if your app functions and you can figure out how to monitor the Docker engine with all the Docker monitoring tools out there, then, centralized logging, you can use something like ELK or Loggly or Papertrail or just any other tool out there, right, for logging. And once you figure out those sort of hard parts, you kind of solve the problem with Swarm. And you may not need to go to that higher level of complexity with Openshift. But if you plan on having a lot of complexity and you need a single vendor support, and when I say complexity, I don't just mean you have 100 servers. What I mean is you need specialized hardware. You have specialized requirements for running one-off jobs and all these other sort of little esoteric things on the side. You need, you need more enterprise plugins with all of your existing tooling that maybe Openshift would have because it's maybe a Red Hat-centric ecosystem. So that's the kind of stuff that you have to evaluate. I would say that at the end of the day, for just running web apps and databases and worker jobs and stuff like that, both Swarm and Kubernetes do both of those things. So it's hard to say one is better at that than the other. They really are both the same. But Swarm is almost always easier. So I like easy. I try to go for easy first, and if it doesn't work for me, I'll try the hard thing. Let's see. Good question, though. Great question. And if there's anyone with Openshift experience, please chime in the chat. Give your opinion on what you think about Openshift, especially if you've tried Openshift and something like Swarm. And you can sort of give your take. That'd be great. Brian says, what do you think about ECS? Do you have any plans to make content around ECS? I've started using it with CloudFormation and feel that it offers a lot for my needs. Thanks. That's cool, Brian. Yeah, ECS is another container orchestration technology. It has been around for years. It's been around longer than Swarm. It's been around almost as long as Kubernetes when Kubernetes was announced. And it's grown in its functionality, feature set, and stability. I do not plan on building any content around ECS this year. So, who knows what the future holds, but I don't plan on building on like an ECS course on this year. I don't get a lot of requests for it. And it really the ECS shines when you have an AWS vertical stack. So when you're using CloudFormation and you're using Code Deploy and you're using CloudWatch and you're using everything else in that ecosystem of AWS tooling, that's where I think ECS really shines because it can plug into all those tools easier and the workflow is easier because you can use the AWS CLI, that sort of stuff. When you start to do multi-cloud or on-premise data center hybrid stuff, or you don't want to do everything so AWS focused, that's when ECS starts to not, it doesn't work as well, right? That's sort of AWS's play. That's their plan, is that they create great tools for you so that you just stay there and you use all their tools instead of the rest of the ecosystem. So I think a lot of times my ECS opinion is more about, well, where are you at today? Where's your expertise today? What tools are you using today? Where are you deploying to? What cloud are you got? Stuff like that. So if you're all in on the Azure camp and you're using all the Azure tools, then it's probably best to stick with their Kubernetes deployment solution than trying to roll your own, stuff like that. Great question. Dragoon says, what tools would you use to automate creation and administration of a swarm? Yeah, so there's Portainer. Portainer is a GUI. It doesn't necessarily deploy anything. Docker Enterprise runs Swarm underneath and will automatically set up the nodes. So that's a thing you can do if you're looking for paid tools. If you need, because Swarm is 2 lines, right? You install Docker and you Docker Swarm or Docker init, right? Docker Swarm join to join a worker node or a manager node, and Docker Swarm init is the thing you run the first time. So it's only 2 lines. I'm not sure how much we all need an extra deployment tool for Swarm, right? Docker Machine doesn't deploy the new Swarm. It actually, if you look at Docker Machine, it has capabilities for the old Swarm years and years ago, Swarm Classic, because that required a bunch of extra setup. You had to install etcd, create an etcd cluster. You had to provision the data into that cluster and set up all the right endpoints. So there was work involved. With Docker Swarm, it's designed to be as easy as possible out of the box and secure by default. So I'm not really sure what we need in tooling there, right? If you go looking around, you'll find that there are Ansible, Terraform stuff for Swarm, and you can certainly check that out. But it's really, at the end of the day, it's just 2 commands. It's just making sure that Docker's on the machine, which every tool on the planet has some sort of Docker engine installer, right? Which is just a package for your distribution. And then you just do Docker Swarm join, and you need the key. So what I do is I simply create, like let's say AWS. I create an AWS auto-scaling group, which allows you to give it a template, and then it will create many machines, however many machines you want. If you kill a machine or if it kills a machine, it'll recreate that machine, right? So when I make that definition, you are able to put in a cloud init, and that's just a little script that starts when the instance starts. So in that instance startup script, you would just tell it to install Docker, right? So it's going to install the Docker engine, and then you would paste in that Docker Swarm join key. So you would have that command, Docker Swarm join, with the key, and you would have that in the cloud init script, and then that machine would join the Swarm when it first boots up. And then that's how you would dynamically grow your infrastructure or provision new nodes in an automated way. So it doesn't have to be a whole lot harder than that. Of course, you might want to add things like labels and do other sort of custom Docker configurations and stuff like that if you want to, but you can do all that in that command, or you can do something with Ansible or like I think you mentioned CloudFormation earlier. Brian mentioned that. You can use CloudFormation for that. You can use Terraform for that. But those are really all just bash stuff. It's just a bunch of bash lines, right? So if you've got opinions, if anyone out there's got good tools, feel free to throw them out there. To my knowledge, I'm not aware that Portainer can install Docker for me, add it to the Swarm. Maybe it can. I haven't looked at that particular feature closely. So, good question. Yeah, Dragoon's talking to Tim saying, yeah, use Portainer mostly to monitor. Yeah. Josh asks, will you do a course on microservices with console, HA proxy, etc., maybe with Node or Java? So I'm about to release my Docker for Node.js course that we've been working on for quite some time. And that is definitely got some components. If you're a Node.js developer, it's going to be the #1 course for you integrating Node.js with containers, right? It's designed for people that know Node and know a little bit of Docker, but they really want the ultimate Docker setup for Node that includes local development, how they would run testing in CI and CD, and how they would deploy that in production. So that course talks about Node.js microservices. I give some examples of how you set that up in Compose and how you would deploy that, how you would deal with things like proxies, different endpoints and redirecting with host headers, stuff like that. So that's all in there. I do not have plans for an additional microservices dedicated course, although the rest of this year is taken for in terms of all the content that's going to be created. But if I get more, I'm making whatever you all want the most. So if I get more requests for people to do something like that, that's a dedicated microservices course. A microservices course too is there's a lot of takes on it, right? Because you could really for a lot of developers, microservices is about their language. So microservices for Java with Spring, and microservices for Ruby on Rails or Go language or whatever. I chose node.js because it's one of my favorites. You could build an entire Python course on microservices. So if you're talking about microservices in terms of backend infrastructure, that would probably be a separate course, right? So talking about all the different DevOps tools that you would need, but really that's not so much microservices, that's just distributed computing. Because when we start talking about orchestration or multiple servers that we have to deploy our apps onto, that's where all these tools are going. The reason we have console and HA proxy, well, maybe not HA proxy, but with console and the service discovery that we're all talking about nowadays, service discovery is about your different applications finding where all the other apps live, because when you have everything in such a dynamic infrastructure that's constantly changing, it gets difficult for your apps to make sure that they always have the proper endpoints for all the other apps. And if things change and back-end endpoints change, how do those apps that you're currently using get updated, right? And so as you get more advanced into your automation and your deployment strategies, service discovery will become a harder problem, and there's different ways to solve it, right? Docker tends to solve it with just pure DNS. Things like Console and Zookeeper and etcd, these are all backends that are running a distributed database and allow you to have endpoints to request what things are needed. And you've got more tools coming out of the Kubernetes ecosystem that allows you to do all sorts of really crazy advanced stuff. So I think at some point, definitely a course on that infrastructure and all those pieces to that service discovery puzzle, that's definitely going to be on my radar. I don't plan on doing it this year, though. I think getting this course out, definitely something with Kubernetes, updating the current courses, the Docker Mastery, stuff like that, working on some other stuff that I've got ideas around, CI/CD, maybe stuff like that. So lots of stuff to talk about, but I don't know about that one. Well, maybe next year, maybe 2020. Good question. John, do you have any suggested resources for supporting issues regarding sign-in issues with a Drupal swarm? Can't sign back into my website after a DigitalOcean outage. Drupal.org has not been helpful. So John, I'm not sure exactly your issue. So after a DigitalOcean outage, so the first question I would ask is, if you can't sign back in, does your Drupal storage still exist, right? Did you lose a node where you had the storage for the databases and then the content storage for Drupal itself? Did you have that on local volumes on a particular node, and then maybe those containers moved to a different node, and then that storage was stuck on the original node? If that's potentially the case, then you may just need to go find where the data is at in the volumes on the nodes that it used to be on. You got to move that manually. If you're going to be in a swarm, and that's a multi-server orchestration, or if you're going to do Kubernetes, you need a back-end shared storage system. And with Swarm, the easiest way to do that is with RexRay. RexRay, that's at rexray.io. And RexRay allows you, it acts sort of like a storage orchestrator, where it allows you to connect the services in your Swarm to either cloud storage or some sort of shared storage that you've got off server, and then it will manage the Docker volume connections for you. So that way, when your containers move around and they hop from node to node because you've had an update or you've had a server outage or something like that, you've deployed new versions of your app, so you can't guarantee they'll be on the same machine. When you do that, the RexRay drivers and plugin will basically go and reconnect the storage back into the proper node for you before the container starts. And Kubernetes does a similar thing. It has some stuff built out of the box. It can also use RexRay, but it has tooling built in. And this is a sort of an orchestration problem. And that would be my first guess, that it's not necessarily related to Drupal, and so you wouldn't go looking at Drupal documentation on that. It's that your Drupal somehow has lost the information that it had from maybe the previous server. So hopefully that you have that off disk, and if not, you can somehow migrate that to shared storage using something like RexRay, so that no matter what node you're on, your applications will have access to that data. That's a good question, though. Good luck with the troubleshooting, and let me know how it goes. All right, next question. Let's look here. Yeah, Biker's saying, thanks about the Swarm KA comments. Yes, the IT people are skittish because they've heard some stories about problems. Nervous Nellies. Yeah, and that's the thing. Because these tools are so new, we all haven't done it before, right? And we haven't tried these things before. And for a business to sort of bank their production on some open source tool that they can't just call a vendor on. That's why I always encourage getting Docker Enterprise. Even if you just get basic support, they have a basic support package. That way you can get help with Swarm even if you don't want to deploy the Docker Enterprise. And I would recommend that whether or not you do Kubernetes, getting some sort of support, especially if it's new and you're going to do production, right? You don't always have to have support. You can let the support contracts lapse, and if you don't need them anymore. But I think out of the gate, those kinds of support tools, I say buy them and use the crap out of them. Like, use them for everything. You get the most money you can out of it, because that's what they're there for. I think a lot of people, they buy support packages, and we all have egos, right? We all like to think we know how to do it ourselves, and we'll research the internet and figure it out ourselves. And that's not always the shortest way to get things done. So I myself am guilty of that. Once you're in open source, you tend to be more of a tinkerer, and you're doing things yourself, and you're used to doing it, and not asking a third-party vendor for help. But if you have any type of budget, I would say, regardless of what your choices are, get a support contract in place so that you can use it, and then use it regularly. And then once you no longer find yourself needing it, don't renew it. And you don't always need to wait for a break fix, right? If you're trying to figure out a problem, a lot of those support calls you can sort of finagle it into a way where it's a little more guidance related. And I know that a lot of companies don't want me to tell you that, because they would rather you just call for break fix. And if it's guidance, Microsoft's famous for this. If it's guidance that you're looking for, that's a different team with a different contract and that sort of thing. So you don't, sometimes you can just say, we tried this and it didn't work. and then their guidance, their ticket will basically say, well, yeah, that's because you can't do it that way. You should be doing it this way. And maybe you can work it out that way. So that's my advice, really, is to help them with their nervous, because if they're nervous, it means that there's probably a lack of experience and a lack of knowledge, right? And that's okay. We all have that problem when something's new. And so I would look at getting them as many resources as I could, right? Have them take my course, of course. The Swarm Mastery course, swarmmastery.com. Get my coupons, right? That if you go to that website, you get the best coupon. And then have them check that out at least. Have them watch DockerCon talks on Swarm and hear all the people talking about production deployments of Swarm. So anyway, there's some good stuff there. And if you ping me later, I can look up some DockerCon videos for you that you might want to check out with Swarm and maybe give to them. I have a couple on Swarm. There's some other people that talk about their experience going production with Swarm, stuff like that. So if you're motivated to stick with Swarm and to do Swarm, right? If you're going to just go Kubernetes, then there's obviously all that stuff too. So, all right, good stuff. Top 5. I'm new here. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm new here. I'm a trainee and want to introduce Docker to us in the company. Do you have projects that are relatively easy to implement so that I can demonstrate the possibilities to my trainers? So that's a great question. There are lots of things you can try. One of them, obviously, is, I would be remiss if I wouldn't just say, have them take my Docker Mastery course, because there's all sorts of stuff in there, and all the code and everything in there is open source. So once one person learns it, they can try those tools and things with other people. Another thing you can try is just do the docs, right? The Docker docs. So docs.docker.com, there is a walkthrough there. That is something that they can start, getting started with Docker, and it's text only, but it's a good walkthrough. The next thing you could try is play with Docker. So if you go to training.playwithdocker, what's great about this is they don't even need to have Docker installed. And Marcos, the guy I was going to have on the call today, he's the one that runs this. He actually co-created this with his buddy. And there are lessons in here to get you started with Docker, and you do it in the browser. It actually creates the terminal in the browser, so you don't even need to worry about installing Docker, which for brand new people, that can be, the first hour of their learning is just how to get the thing working and properly on their machine. So check that out. That is another one. And then, of course, the open source that all of my real-world workshops are based on. If you just go to container training, we mentioned this earlier, right? So if you go to the container training website and scroll all the way to the bottom, these are all the open source slides that you're free to reuse because it's all open source, right? So they're MIT licensed, I believe. And you can look at the Introduction to Docker and Containers, and that is a slide deck that is meant for self-paced walkthrough. Now, of course, videos are always easier to watch, but there's 700 slides in here. So you could walk yourself through it or have them walk themselves through it, and every slide has its own URL, so you can sort of bookmark things and come back to that slide, and you can go through those. These are the same slides when I do live workshops. I use these slides. I'll usually add some new ones or update them in case they're outdated, and then I'll customize to based on the amount of time we have in the audience. I'll take out sections and stuff like that. But you can see there's all these chapters that you can walk through, and it's not as good as something like my course where I explain things to you and I walk you through demos and stuff like that. But that stuff's there. So let me send you those into the chat here. I have 3 physical Docker hosts to play with. Oh, that's cool. So learning resources. So the first one I would give you is mine for the courses. And then the docs for the getting started. That's just a doc walkthrough that you can do locally. Then the training website that's interactive. There's another one called Kata Containers. There's another website that's called Kata Containers, which you can check out. And then here is the slides from the open source repo for Docker 101. And yeah, I mean, honestly, for people that are just learning Docker, so it's easiest to get someone started with learning right now. Like if you only had 10 minutes, if you just give them a server and shell into it, right? My preference, however, when someone's learning right away is to get them on their local machine, because unless they're completely ops focused and they're really not interested in running it locally, they just want to know how to run servers, having it locally on your machine and running some of those basic commands and seeing how easy it is to spin up software, like, use this one line to spin up a MySQL server, and then they have a local running MySQL server, and then they can throw it away, and then they can create a new one. That sort of workflow locally, I feel like clicks better with people. They understand that, and that makes more sense to them than saying, I have this remote server, never mind the fanciness in the cloud, and just go in there and log and type these commands and go to this website. So I go back and forth. I think it just depends on the audience and how much time I have. If I have a really short timeline and I don't know my audience, I don't know if they have Docker set up, then I'll always prefer to use something like Play with Docker, because then I know that, this even works on an iPad. You can do this on an iPad. I've seen people do it. They've actually come to my workshop with an iPad and used it in a browser. So good luck, and I'm excited for your team. It's going to be a fun, usually Docker training is super fun because people, once they get it, and they love it. They love how easy to use it is. All right. This is my first contact here. Is it really live? Yes. Yes, Marin, it is live. My friend just asked me how he can connect a Docker container from a VNC viewer and see the GUI. How to achieve this? That is a great question. You can't. There is no GUI for Docker. Obviously, if you talk about orchestration, like Swarm of Kubernetes, or managing servers on the internet, you can add web GUIs just like everything else has a web GUI. MySQL has a web GUI, but MySQL itself does not have a GUI built in, right? It's a database server. So the same thing with Docker. Docker is a daemon that runs in the background, and it's a command line. So you can remotely connect to a server or any Docker engine from the command line using SSH and various methods at the command line. But if you needed a GUI on a server, you could probably use something like Portainer. That's a very popular one that was already been mentioned earlier, Portainer.io. And that can be on any server. It's not meant for managing your local machine. It's meant for managing servers. So hopefully that helps. If you have more questions, throw them at the bottom of the chat, and I'll get to them in a minute. Brian, thanks for answering my question. Yes, I'm all in on AWS, and I love the tight integration ECS has with other tools. So there you go, Brian. Easy answer. Easy answer. ECS all the way. And then when you want to get more, if you want to get into the Kubernetes camp, then you can look at ECS for Kubernetes, EKS, Fargate, stuff like that. People go that route because they don't necessarily want to have all pure AWS stuff. They want to have the Kubernetes way of doing things, and they want tools that are compatible with Kubernetes. You maybe don't need that if you just want to stick with pure play AWS. So you may not even need to jump onto Kubernetes just because it's the thing everybody talks about on the internet, right? Victor says, this is a basic question. I'm learning about Docker. I created a container using a volume, but later on I realized that I need to use another volume. What would be the next steps to fix that issue? So I want to have 2 volumes at the same time. Well, that's an easy answer. You add 2 volumes, right? You can repeat that command. So if you're talking about using a Docker run command, then you would just add more -v's. So like -v the first volume, -v the second volume, and eat your heart out. You can have as many of those as you want. Some of them can be bind mounts. Some of those can be named volumes. Some can be anonymous volumes. That's in case you know the different volume types. Different volumes can use different plugins. So you could have remote volumes that connect to different storage using Docker storage plugins, or Docker volume plugins, rather. So yeah, there's lots of flexibility there. It's funny because something that's, when you're brand new, that's not super obvious that you can reuse that. And the same is true for a lot of the Docker run options. If you're using Swarm or Kubernetes, you would do that stuff in the YAML configurations, and you would just repeat the different volume commands for persistent storage, and that would connect to all of those at the same time. Now, if you have a running container, there is no way to connect or mount volumes to live containers. You would need to recreate that container and then mount it to the volumes when you recreate it. Hopefully that helps. Kylex, thanks. When is my next course? That will be Docker for Node.js, and you will hear as soon as I know the date for launch, which sometime between now and DockerCon. Biker says, yeah, I think you may need to create your own networks as attachable. Yeah, so the as attachable, that's for Swarm only. So if you're talking about Swarm networks for overlay, you have to create them to attach them to standard containers. But if you're just talking about non-Swarm, just regular old bridge networks and host networks, then you can just connect them. There is no as attachable. That's a Swarm-specific feature. But good tip on that. When will you create a Kubernetes mastery course? So I would say wait around. Keep showing back up. There is already a plan in the works. I kind of hinted at that earlier for that, and I'm working with some smart people on that. And we're gonna have something to talk about here in a little bit, in a couple of months. So doesn't mean it's gonna launch in a couple of months. Just something to talk about. Got to get through DockerCon and stuff like that. So you'll hear something this summer as we talk about the plans for that and what's going to happen. Santiago says, do you have a best practice Docker 12 app factory with Node.js and MySQL repo and recommendations? Ooh, yes, that is going to be in my upcoming Docker for Node.js course. So the best way to know about my courses is typing this in the chat, is at HTTPS, my newsletter. So get on my newsletter, and I announce, I don't do it frequently. It's not something that you'll see every week. It's not like a list of all the news happenings this week. It's more about what things are cool that I'm working on, what things that I've found are cool, what stuff has come out of this, what that you all are sharing and that I'm talking about. And so that comes out, I don't know, once, twice a month maybe. It's a little more frequent lately, but yeah. That best practices for .NET. I'm sorry, not .NET. Node.js. Got .NET on my brain. Node.js and 12 app or 12 factor apps is what they're called. In case you're not sure what that is a list of 12 factors that are best for distributed applications and cloud applications. So check that out, because if you make apps with these factors in mind, you will be making apps that are easier to deploy and manage in the cloud and with Docker. This has actually been around a long, long time. So it was pre-Docker. It's been around at least a decade, I think. But everything in it is compatible with the ideas of container orchestration and Docker and cloud deployments and hybrid computing and stuff like that. So yes, that's definitely something I always put in all my courses, because I believe these are 12 factors that help us make good apps and make things that are easy to maintain. So let's see. Raj says, I am having a bit of a problem running Docker with Protractor. What are the general troubleshooting areas that one needs to keep in mind when running Protractor with Docker? I've never used it. Don't know. Sorry about that. That's a good one. That's a good one for the chat. I don't have a good answer. If anyone else in chat has tried that, then give your tips. But I don't know. All right. So it looks like we're out of questions. I'll give you a couple of seconds to throw your last questions in. But otherwise, we have wrapped it up. And as you know, I have an increasing list of resources over on my website, brettfisher.com/Docker. Make sure you like and subscribe this channel, and when you click the subscribe button, there's a little dinner bell, a little ringer bell there. Click that, and then you'll get notified whenever I go live. Between now and DockerCon, we may be doing a couple of extra episodes with some special guests. So the only way you're going to know that that's happening live is if you click the bell, so that you get that little pop-up notification when I go live, which is every Thursday, assuming that I'm here, and then sometimes extra times, sometimes on Twitch. In case you are a Twitch fan, just look me up on Twitch. You'll find me in there. And thanks for joining the AMA. I will see you next week live on the internet.